Good morning, Andom. Did I say your name correctly? Because this is a hard one, and I didn't even start with your last name yet.
Oh man, yeah. Now my first name is Andom. Andom.
And how do you say your last name? Because I
No,
was gonna try, but I said nah.
you gotta try. You gotta try.
Let me see. Ghebreghiogis.
The ending wasn't too bad. Ghebreghiorgis.
Is this a Greek kind of name?
Yeah, so my family comes from Eritrea. It's near Ethiopia in East Africa, but 50% of Eritrea and Ethiopia is Orthodox Christian, roughly 50%. So that's where you get the similarities with Greek, because they're Greek Orthodox, a lot of Greek Orthodox. So the Georgis just means Saint George.
Okay, I'm African as well, from Mozambique.
Ok, falo português.
Português, é verdade. E tu falas alguma coisa em português ou não?
No, I used to do capoeira for a little bit, so that's how I.
That's Brazilian. That's Brazilian.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Andom, you a young man. How old are you?
We should just play a guessing game. You know, I had you try my last name. I should now have you guess my age.
I would say 32.
Yeah, right around there, 34.
34.
35 in August. Yeah.
You a young man. Young man, and you was aspiring a very high position. You know, congressman for the state of New York, District 16. Tell us, before we go further, let me make it clear to our audience that Yonkers Voice itself does not endorse or oppose any candidate. Our only goal is to inform the people of who is who, what they're running for, what the platform is. Then it's up to the people to decide who is the best person for the job. So just now that we got that out of the way, Andom, tell us, what makes you run?
Yeah, it's a excellent question, and I think especially seeing right now the urgency of the moment that we're in right now, particularly in Westchester, New York City metro area with the coronavirus pandemic. You know, we really don't have time to wait to deal with the exigencies of what's going on in our communities. Me, I was a special education teacher in the Bronx. I grew up in Mount Vernon, still live in Mount Vernon. And being a teacher in the Bronx, I saw disinvestment in our communities. I saw what happens when issues are left unaddressed and the status quo just persists. And what we've seen in our district is that we've had the same representation for 30 years. And in many respects in our community, especially when we're looking at socioeconomic indicators, our community is struggling. And not only is it struggling, things are getting worse and worse. I saw this very clearly in the Bronx. I see it in Mount Vernon, and I see it throughout the District 16 and the metro area. And so when I look at someone like Representative Engel, who's been in office for 30 years, I don't see the transformative politics that are important and necessary in the area where I grew up in Mount Vernon, in the area where I taught in the Bronx, in parts of Yonkers, throughout the district. I mean, we have a representative who is the chair of House Foreign Affairs, and he's been diverting our public money to wars abroad. You know, he voted for the war in Iraq, voted against Obama's Iran nuclear deal. We spend $700 billion towards the military-industrial complex. Yet at the same time, we have veterans who are struggling here at home, and the average American and working person is struggling here at home. We need to be investing in our communities, investing in education, investing in housing. And that's why I decided to run, because I saw that the status quo was just persisting.
Now, Andom, what would you tell to those guys that said, look, he's been there for, 20 years? How long?
31 years.
31 years. He's been there for 31 years. He's been elected time after time after time. Maybe the people of New York is happy. Otherwise, we would have voted him out before. So what would you tell those folks?
Look, I think that there are definitely some people in the district who are happy with Eliot Engel, but I believe that they are certainly in the minority. I say that not only because of where Eliot Engel and much of the Democratic representation has actually stood on issues, particularly progressive issues that I know are priorities in our district, but also when you look at turnout, in Westchester and the Bronx, under 10% of people have turned out for congressional elections. So we have a small group of a voting population actually determining for the entire district, who they want them to represent them. So so much of our campaign has been about bringing in new voices, letting people know who have been historically disengaged, historically excluded into the electoral process. Because we know that when these people's voices are included, and this tends to be predominantly low-income people, people of color who have not voted at percentages that we would like to see, we know that we'll have new representation, because our representation right now is just allowing, again, the status quo to persist.
Now, how do you feel about term limits, sir?
Yeah, I mean, I think term limits are certainly a conversation to have. I think for me, what's more important is looking at term length. I actually think 2 years for congressional elections, I think it's too short. I think it makes it so that so much of what candidates do is just fundraising, and then the next year they're back in election mode. And so I think it actually doesn't allow the right amount of time to be able to actually implement a plan and listen to people. So much of what it means to be a representative is to actually be able to listen. So if you're already worrying about your next race before you've actually had the opportunity to listen to our district, we have one of the most socioeconomically racially diverse districts in the entire country. I mean, in Yonkers by itself, you can see that. But when you go compare Scarsdale to the Northeast Bronx, Co-op City to Riverdale, just to be able to listen takes time. So for me, I'm more about thinking about term length instead of 2 years, 3 to 4 years, but term limits is certainly an important conversation to have.
Now, and people that, those that will decide to vote, and by the way, guys, you should all come out and vote. It's not, I don't think it's optional, but an obligation. You should all come out and vote. Now, for those that will be coming out and vote, they need to understand the fundamental differences between you and Congressman Engel. Can you put in words what is the fundamental difference between you and him?
Yeah, so I would say, just to start off, is I am someone who is outside of the entrenched political system. And so what that means is I have a connection to the grassroots. I am part of the grassroots, and I've been listening to local voices not only my entire life, but still currently. I am of this community. And as a teacher, I saw this firsthand. Again, as I said, I saw how the intersection of affordable housing crises affecting education. I saw what happens when families struggle with employment, struggle with healthcare, how that affects their students, and how you see then the school to prison pipeline be able to systemically destroy communities. When I look at it specifically on the issues, right now, if we're looking at Representative Engel, a lot of times what I hear people say is, oh, he's the chair of House Foreign Affairs. He has all this power. He has this privilege. But my question then is, what has our representative been using his power and privilege for? As I said before, in 2003, when I was a high school junior and senior protesting against the war in Iraq, he was voting for it. In 2011, he had the opportunity to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. He voted against withdrawing troops. And we see right now the Taliban has as much power as they've ever had. 2015 voted against Obama's Iran nuclear deal. 2016 voted against prohibiting weapons transfers to Saudi Arabia in their inhumane bombing of Yemen. And I say all this because a lot of times people say, like, oh, well, like, what about us in Yonkers and Mount Vernon? This connects because this is money that's going out of our communities and contributing to death abroad. We have people dying in our communities because the government is not effectively taking care of them, is not effectively creating systems and guarantees to ensure that people are able to survive. And so for me, what I stand for is not only taking money out of this military industrial complex that itself is not contributing even to veterans as much as it should, but it's actually investing in resources at home, making sure that we can fully fund public education, making sure that we have Medicare for all, and we're able to actually address systemic racial inequities that even if we had Medicare for all would still make it so that people of color disproportionately lack medical access. Ensuring that we have a federal job guarantee to make sure that we're able to have social services, health care for elders, universal child care, and as well deal with the Green New Deal, because this necessitates reorienting our entire economy. So these are just a couple of huge differences that myself and Elliot Engel have. He also voted for the 94 crime bill. He has not really, when it comes to housing, pushed as much as we need to when it comes to a homes guarantee, which is something that I support. And we see particularly people in Westchester and the Bronx are severely, severely rent burdened. So I went through a lot of things, but a lot of it has to do with disinvestment from the war industry and investing in our home.
And I have here a series of segments to go through with you, but you are anticipating me. You're reading my mind. You're reading my mind.
There are a lot of issues. There are a lot of issues.
Definitely, definitely. Actually, the federal job is guaranteed was one of them. But how are you going to accomplish that? Yes, it's nice to write a bullet line on a bulletin board, but we want to know how. What would you do to achieve your agenda, or what you propose and what you promise? How would you do that? The federal job is guaranteed.
Yeah, so I think so much of this is really just about building coalitions on the ground and actually organizing people. Yes, a lot of it has to do with being able to work with members of Congress and deal with diverse stakeholders, so you're actually able to convince them. But so much of this actually happens on the grassroots and is really about mobilizing people to demand what we need in our own communities. What we've been having so far throughout American history, but we've seen it reach a point that is really coming to a head over the last 20 years, we've seen economic inequality at some of its worst points ever. And this affects all people. We see also that we hear all the time, climate change is real. We understand what happened with Hurricane Sandy, particularly Yonkers on the riverfront. We know what's going to happen if we don't deal with surging waters. So really what it comes down to is making sure people are understanding what is the alternative if we don't fully mobilize all of our people to actually deal with the challenges that we have of the day. So when we're talking about a federal jobs guarantee, it means making sure that the government is an employer of last resort and allocating our resources, of which labor is one of them, into areas of the economy that are right now not really being addressed. So one of those things, right, again, is making sure that we have green infrastructure. That's a huge issue in Westchester. Another thing is, again, as I said before, social care services, helping the elderly when it comes to elder care, making sure that we have universal child care. So part of this is about reorienting our economy. You go to certain parts of Mount Vernon, you go to certain parts of Yonkers, you see particularly low income and people of color at a disproportionate rate have high, what's called a NEET stat, N-E-E-T, and that's not in education, employment, or training. Our society has basically called certain people expendable. And I'm saying, no, none of us are expendable. It's not even that we're not even expendable. We need everyone to deal with the challenge we have today. And I hope coronavirus has made that clear to people.
Adam, before we go to other subjects, as you know, we are live streaming as we go, and there is questions coming in. So once in a while, I might have to interrupt you, and I apologize, but we want to address the audience that is asking some questions. And there is a delay between what you hear me saying and what they hear and see. There is a 20 seconds delay. So we might be on another subject, and the question from the subject before might be coming in.
No problem.
I have a question from Caroline Elizabeth Marie.
Okay.
And her question is, if we had Medicare for all, how would the 20% be paid? Normal Medicare only covers 80% of the medical bill. I really don't know what she means, but that's the question that she poses.
Yeah. So in terms of the payment, I think a lot of times we focus on how we're able to actually pay for things, that's not really the focus of what we should be looking at. When we're looking at actually Medicare, a Medicare for all system, a single payer system, compared to what we have now, we're actually looking at saving our economy trillions and trillions of dollars. Just on administrative savings, we're looking in the billions of dollar range, hundreds of billions of dollars. So I believe it's around $556 billion. So already just in the administrative savings that happen from when we have one system, when we have a system that is ensuring that we have mental health care, comprehensive reproductive care, when we're looking at elder care, when we're looking at people who are not having to worry about whether they can actually go to the hospital or not, the money that we save from people being able to avoid lost wages, lost productivity, we're saving trillions of dollars. So it's not about us being able to pay for it. It's actually just a matter of us saying that we are not going to prioritize an industry that allows profit to take priority over people's life. And so when we think about it in that framework, this is a value framework and not a financial framework, even though when we look at it from the financial frame, we save, again, trillions of dollars over a 10-year span, we realize that there's really no other alternative. Medicare for all is the greatest poverty reducing measure that we would have in this country. 20% of people are in poverty just because of medical out-of-pocket expenses. The average family with 2 kids will see that their expenses for Medicare will drop close to $1,000 just by having a single payer system. And so there's really no other alternative. We're able to pay for it.
Well, and actually, there is lots of people, and if you look around the political atmosphere of today, you see that some people, including the president of United States of America, believes in economy over life. Look around at the rush to reopen with the pandemic still growing. So somebody feels like, yes, economy and money comes before life of the American citizens. How do you see that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just exactly what I said a second ago.
Yes.
They consider many of us expendable. And largely this is, low income people, immigrants, people of color, women, LGBTQ. We see society considers many of us expendable. And I think I even saw a comment, about, all of this sounds great, but it's about doability versus hope. We can actually have a long-term vision that is rooted in humanity, that is rooted in compassion, that's rooted in empathy, while at the same time working to achieve material gains. If we are always willing to sacrifice our humanity, the fact, the primacy on life that you were just speaking about, Ru, then, we're always sacrificing our vision, and we're never going to be actually okay with where we're at. We need to understand that the system that we have right now does not prioritize average working people. And that needs to be held up to our long-term vision. And we can have material gains, but if we're always recognizing in the end that we want to achieve a goal, then we're moving towards that goal. It might not come as fast as we want, but we're able to have a plan and a concrete plan of action to achieving that in the long term. Trump has been very, very clear that he doesn't prioritize our lives. And so we continue to fight. That's about mobilizing us on the ground. One of the things we're doing in our campaign is working with so many different community-based organizations, people throughout the district. And so when Elda speaks about hope, we're a stronger coalition when we're united right here in the grassroots. And I think that will actually be able to create and actualize a lot of the plans we have.
Housing for all. That's a very complex. It's easy to write that on a piece of paper, but the plan to accomplish it, it's a whole different thing. And then we go back to the comment placed by Elda Perez Mejia. All sounds great. However, no one has a real plan, an actual economic plan based on doability versus hope. No, I guess we need to, yes, we can say whatever we want, but saying it does not accomplish anything, and plans do.
100%.
And I remember on the last presidential election, lack of planning was there as well. And the plan was vote for me and you will see. Is that same plan with you? Vote for you and we will see? Or do you have a concrete plan on how to achieve the things that you promise or you promise to change?
Yeah, well, vote for me and you'll see. It's a nice rhyme, but it's definitely not. It's definitely not what we're banking on. If you look at our website and our platform, andomforny.com. That's ANDOMFORNY.com. You'll see we have one of the most comprehensive platforms of any congressional candidate in the entire country. And when it comes to housing, as you're speaking about, one of the main things we're first recognizing is that housing is a human right. And so if we recognize housing as a human right, we're then able to move forward from there saying, okay, what do we need to do to ensure that there is no one who is unhoused, that people who are renting do not face severe burdens just to be able to have a home and to live. And so I think there are a couple things that we can do and actualize in the immediacy. First is institute and enact an Economic Fair Housing Act. And this will eliminate exclusionary zoning laws. It'll allow for equitable zoning and make it easier to build affordable, dense housing that is actually able to integrate neighborhoods. We know here, again, in our district, Mount Vernon, Yonkers, particularly in Westchester, residential segregation is a huge issue. And this bleeds into education issues. One of the other things we want to say is, okay, we've seen that housing discrimination has been a huge issue historically, still is. We want to reinstitute the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which came out of the which was taken away from Trump, and we saw what it was able to do with the Obama era. We also need to make sure that we're increasing the housing stock, particularly affordable housing stock. And so we need to make sure that we're allocating money towards the National Housing Trust Fund. If we're able to allocate between 3 to 4 billion in being able to develop affordable housing, then that will be able to contribute to, again, making sure we have actionable steps where people are not unhoused. We also see we have the Fair Cloth Amendment. The Fair Cloth Amendment prohibits basically public spending towards developing federal government spending towards affordable housing. We need to repeal the Fair Cloth Amendment so our localities can actually use HUD funding to increase affordable housing stock. All of these things are intertwined, and we have concrete plans towards it. When we look at rent subsidies, it'll be like this. I can go on about this, but this is the last thing I say in case there are any other questions. We see that, again, people are severely rent burdened. The renting costs have inflated dramatically, and they've not kept up with wages have not kept up with them. So we need to make sure that we're setting aside and allocating money for rent subsidies to severely rent burdened families, which is for a lot of people, particularly in the Northeast Bronx and then also in Southern Westchester. I always come back to this stat, Rue. 10% of students are homeless in Mount Vernon, close to 10% in Yonkers, 10% in New York City, in Tarrytown and Peekskill. So I mean, it's just unacceptable.
Now, as you know, we're live, as I told you earlier, so I have to give a shout out to my audience.
Yeah, definitely.
And to thank them to be here watching this show. Rocio McGill, Jeffrey Meyer. Jeffrey, I hope you're feeling better, you're doing better, and hope to see you soon. Bree Harris, Stephanie Matos, Pedro Alvarez, Angeles Maria Cruz, Hector Santiago, Elaine Cater, Thomas John Rooney, Leonardo DJ Santos Suazo. I had to work hard on that name too, and Santos Suazo did not come easy. Okay.
Santos Suazo, what's up? What's up?
Yeah. So, talking about housing in Yonkers, our mayor, I interview our mayor and many other elected officials very often. And one thing that we are all proud of, including myself, is that Yonkers is a diverse and inclusive city. But with that all inclusiveness and diversity, many of us cannot afford housing, not because we don't work, but because we cannot afford it. You know, new buildings coming to Yonkers, yes, we got the 10% in the buildings, but the population in Yonkers is growing so quick and the rents are going up so quick at the same speed as the city is growing that we cannot afford to live in a city that we grew up. Yeah. Do you see that as a big problem?
100%. I mean, we see that just in Westchester, 50% of renters are rent burdened. You have close to 60,000 families that are at risk of displacement. So part of it is just, again, recognizing that tenants have basic rights, especially being on the brink of eviction constantly just because people are unable to afford their rent. This is a huge issue that we have. This is one of the reasons why we were very, very happy to see the progressive legislation that was passed here in New York around tenants' rights. We need to institute national rent control. We need to make sure that tenants and renters have the right to counsel in housing court, that there are just cause protections for evictions. And at the same time, when it comes to new housing, that's one of the reasons why I was speaking about before around the construction of affordable housing, the construction of social and public housing, and using federal government funds to make sure that that's possible.
Now, we're going to go to another bullet line on your palm card: progressive foreign policy of peace.
Yes.
Please elaborate on that.
Yeah, so I mean, right now we don't necessarily see it on the TV all the time, but the U.S. is embroiled in many wars abroad. We have, you're from Mozambique. We have 10,000 U.S. military personnel on the African continent right now. We're embroiled in wars in the Middle East, and as I said before, we have $700 billion that we spend towards the military-industrial complex. And what this military-industrial complex is it's maintaining bases, 800 bases in 80 countries around the world. And what we've seen is this does not actually contribute to peace. In fact, what it does is actually escalate conflicts throughout the world. And if you look at our history,
and I'm sorry, is not contributing to peace, but it's preventing war. And by preventing war, you actually achieving peace. Am I wrong, or that is the equation faulty?
Well, I think that that might be the perspective that some have, but I think when you look at actually U.S. history in terms of how these wars have actually gone about, really what it is us intervening in the affairs of other countries. And most of these other countries, actually, they're not military solutions. They're solutions that can only happen with stakeholders involved in their countries working it out. Having this exogenous force, this huge military, enter and dramatically sort of tip the balance in different ways is actually not contribute to peace. If we look at the war in Iraq, we look at the war in Afghanistan, we see ourselves in countries for decades. And look at the war in Afghanistan. Again, like the Taliban has more power now than they did in 2001. And so when we're talking about what that means for us here at home, it means two things. It means, what are we as a moral leader? As a moral leader, if we're intervening in any other nation, well, are we actually even able to say that we care about human rights? Are we able to say that the values that we hold near and dear to us is actually something that's important? But secondly, from a fiscal perspective, we're diverting our money outside of our communities, and it's not contributing to peace abroad. It's not contributing to justice abroad. In fact, what we're doing is exacerbating situations. And we shouldn't be exacerbating those situations, because here at home, we have our own issues. Look just in terms of military aid. We give military aid to countries that commit human rights violations. We give billions of dollars to Saudi Arabia. We make it very, very difficult to make peace between Israel and Palestine possible, because we don't actually challenge Israel when it comes to things like the occupation and the settlements. These are billions of dollars that should be going to our schools, to affordable housing, to healthcare.
Public funded education. Education is the core of everything, basically. Okay, it's the core of success for our children. It's a way to prevent crime. Education basically is everything. So give us a plan, give us your idea about the fully funded public education. And when you talk about public education, are you talking about higher education as well? What's your fundamental plan on that?
Yeah, thanks, Ru, for the question. I think that there are two key things to address when it comes to education. First is when it comes to funding, the disparities in funding that exist between majority minority communities and other communities. We see that there is a huge shortfall in funding for low income schools. And a lot of that is partly because of the reliance on property tax for funding. So that's a huge issue, and we need to make sure that we increase Title I funding to those schools to make sure that all schools are funded at the level that is necessary, and they're equalized across districts. So that's part of it. Part of it is funding, but the other part of it is not 100% about funding, because even if you look at in New York City, for example, the funding is there. It might not be equalized among schools the way we want to, but the funding is there. The issue that we have is the way in which we actually focus on education in this country. And myself as a special education teacher, I saw this very, very clearly. I saw that the fact that we prioritize, for example, having cops in the classroom and not social workers. My school in the Northeast Bronx, we had 500 students in a high needs area, only one social worker. We have punitive discipline models in our school that make it so that if a student commits a certain infraction, they could be suspended for up to 180 days, long-term out of school suspensions. So we need to talk about restorative justice. We need to talk about having more counselors. We need to make sure that there's not as much a priority on high stakes testing. I think the coronavirus and how we've had to shift into remote learning may actually make it so that people are rethinking actually the focus that we give on high stakes testing. We need to make sure that we're investing in culturally responsive education. As a special education teacher, we need to make sure we're investing in educating our students with disabilities and providing those resources for them. So there are a whole host of issues that are not just about funding. Funding is part of it, but another thing is really just reconceptualizing the way in which we focus on school, which right now is very much of it is done in sort of a business mindset, which is not aligned with how educators really think it should be done.
Well, if you talk to some people in Yonkers, our mayor, assemblyman, and many other, Dr. Casada's school superintendent. And the problem in regards to education is funding, is the formula that it's currently in place. Money does not get to Yonkers. The money that we need in order to provide with the good education to our children here in Yonkers. So funding is part of the problem, a big part of the problem, how the money is broken down and how each school district gets the funds necessary to educate our children.
Definitely. Yeah, that's why I break it up into those two issues. Yes, it's about funding, but also when you get that money, you need to be making sure that you're using it in the correct way. And so from a federal level, a lot of what you're speaking about is stuff that's done on the state level, state foundation aid. Right now, there's a huge issue because of all of the loss of money that's coming into the state. We're seeing some proposals around cutting education funding because of everything with coronavirus. But on a federal level, as I'm running for a congressional race, it's really about increasing those Title I funds to making sure low-income schools are getting the money that they need, making sure that if these state shortfalls do happen, that the federal government is there to provide that money to make sure it's fully funded. And then also at the same time, speaking to Title II funds, making sure we're investing in teaching, training, and retaining teachers and social workers of color. That's another huge issue that we have as a Black male teacher. I was maybe 2% of all teachers in America are Black male teachers. So we need to make sure that we're being reflected in the teaching population as well.
Now, this is basically all the time that we had for today, but we have still an important part, to talk about, which is the racial issues and rights for the marginalized group. Before we go into it, explain what is the marginalized group. Are we talking about groups? Are we talking about races? What is your interpretation of these groups that you refer to?
Definitely. It's a great question, Ru, and thank you for asking it. There are so many different ways in which marginalization happens in our country, in our society. Now, when we look at the foundation of America, America itself was founded on settler colonialism, land theft, indigenous genocide, African slavery. Those legacies still persist today. So there is certainly a racial dimension that has always existed in this country. But marginalization certainly happens in other ways. When we look at the pay inequity gap between men and women, when we look at, for example, things like Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, certainly these things have been on the rise after the Trump presidency. They've existed before, certainly, but we've seen them on the rise. Marginalization happens in many different ways. But when we speak about racial justice particularly, we're speaking about marginalization on the identifier of race. And as I said before, this is a long legacy in this country of that. Economically speaking, we see the ways in which Black men and women in particular earn just so much less than white men and women. We see when we look at wealth that there's a 13-to-1 multiplier effect in terms of the wealth gap between Black people and white households. So the racial wealth gap exists. And so being able to address this is first being able to call out the fact that, when we look at actually the data on racial and ethnic groups, that there are differences, and we have to be able to acknowledge that.
Yeah, but if we look at the 60s and we look at today, we two totally different landscape. Now, I strongly believe that racism is well and kicking. It might be masked. Okay, we don't see it as much, but it's still there. It's still there. I strongly think that since the last elections, that we are still seeing, well, not that we are still seeing, that we're seeing more and more. Maybe the masking is coming off.
Exactly. You bring up a great point, Ruth, so much right now, and sometimes it makes it difficult to organize. In the 60s, the racism was extremely explicit. And you still see versions in which it is explicit, obviously, nowadays. I mean, if anyone saw the video yesterday that came out of the young man who was killed, who was jogging and who was killed, I mean, that is a very difficult video to watch. But we see racism embedded in so many of our institutions. We see it in housing. We see it in education. We see it in healthcare. We see it in interactions between the police. So being able to actually look at the data and see sometimes ways in which the racism and white supremacy is actually embedded in these institutions, and is not so much about individual interactions. It's not necessarily about someone calling you the N-word. It's about existing in a system that makes it so that people whose ancestors used to be called the N-word have a difficult time to escape traps of poverty and inequality. And so a lot of that has to do with actually being able to look at racial data. Look, me and you, my family, they're immigrants, right? I was born here, but I'm not sure, Ru, if you were born in Mozambique or you were born here, but we have a different experience with racism than someone whose family came here as an immigrant from the Caribbean in the early 1900s. And they have a different experience than someone whose family is the descendants of American slaves for centuries. And so we need to be able to distinguish, okay, when we're talking about Black Americans, there are many different types of Black Americans, and there are many different experiences of Black Americans. What are the ways in which their experiences with racism are similar? What are the ways in which they're different? And once we know how they're different, then we can be able to target policy specifically to those groups. Same exists with Latinos. When you're looking at, for example, Cubans in Miami, they have a very, very different experience with xenophobia and racism than, say, Puerto Ricans who came to this country in the 1940s, came to New York, I should say, in the 1940s, as there was occupation, but came in the 1940s. They have a very different experience than Dominicans who came fleeing Trujillo. They have a different experience than Dominicans who came just now. So we need to be able to speak to the differences.
Well, this is all that we had for today, but I am going to give you the opportunity to make a closure. Make sure that people understand that just talking about issues is not enough, that if you want things changed, you must come out and vote. Voting has consequences. Who you elect has consequences. So don't just talk about it, do something about it. So make sure, tell the community why it's important, and make whatever closing statements you need to do.
Thank you so much, Ru, and I appreciate you having me on the show. It's been great talking with you. Look, as I said before, I am from this community. I grew up in Mount Vernon, taught in the Bronx. I am a homegrown person who has lived in Westchester my entire life, knows the challenges, the struggles that we have, and also the beauty in our diversity that we have in this small county. But what we've been having in this district is the same representation for 30 years. And yes, there are some things that I agree with when it comes to that representation. But when we look at the urgency of this moment, when we look at the exigencies and the challenges that we're all facing, we need to be able to say that there needs to be bold policies to move us forward. We cannot be okay with economic inequality being at its worst point in 50 years. We cannot be okay now seeing a coronavirus pandemic, which has totally exposed our safety net. We can't be okay with saying, we're not going to have Medicare for all. We're not going to have a hospital in Mount Vernon. We need to expand medical infrastructure in all of our cities, especially cities which have disproportionate health disparities. When we look at current representation, our representation has been diverting money to the war industry when we should be having our public money invested at home. When we look at our representation has been here for 30 years, and they've had the opportunity to push forward and enact bold transformative changes. I'm of a new generation. I'm of a generation that understands what the challenges that we're facing are when it comes to inflation around housing, student college costs, student debt. And when I think about my students, they were born after 9/11. All they've known every year of their life has been war, the threat of climate extinction, the lack of jobs, college unaffordability, wage stagnation, and now they have the coronavirus. Crisis after crisis after crisis. And our leadership has shown that they're not able to stand up to it. And that's why I'm here.
Thank you very much, Andom, for taking the time. Guys, stay tuned for our next guest coming up at 11. Mr. Assemblyman Nader Sayegh is going to come on to give us an update on the pandemic situation affecting not just our city, our county, our state, and our country. Please log in. Thank you very much, and hopefully we will talk again pretty soon, Andom.
Thank you so much, Ru. Appreciate you.
Take care.
Be well. Thank you.